The temple bell rang once, a single, clear note that hung in the cold morning air like a warning more than a call. Fog coiled around the mountain peaks, and the courtyard stones still held the chill of night. A lone Shaolin monk stood barefoot on the topmost terrace, shoulders relaxed, eyes narrowed on the thin line of horizon where the sky met the mist. He did not shift. He did not speak. Each breath was measured, visible in the cold like a quiet metronome marking the seconds. Below, massive wooden gates creaked as they opened, and 3 figures moved through the threshold toward the courtyard. They had not come for blessings or sermons. They had come to test a legend. The monk was known only as Li Shen. He carried no ornate robes, no titles stitched into his sleeve, no documented wins pinned to his record. Yet masters in the temple parted for him as if some invisible current nudged them aside. He trained alone, before dawn, after dusk, repeating forms that no other was allowed to see. These were not forbidden techniques. They were unfinished puzzles, a private craft being shaped in silence. The abbot had agreed to a trial, simple and strict: 1 monk, 3 challengers, no weapons, no malice. Discipline would be the only currency exchanged. The first challenger entered the circle with the quick, staccato energy of a striking bird. He moved with northern Shaolin speed, fists like snapping twigs, kicks that blurred for a heartbeat, constant pressure like a torrent. The air seemed to vibrate around him as he launched a barrage of attacks, each aimed to overwhelm and break through. Li Shen did not raise his hands in defense. He did not brace as if preparing to meet force. Instead, he stepped lightly, almost aside, aligning his center with the changing geometry of each assault. Each punch met air. Each kick found emptiness where a body had been a fraction of a second before. The challenger increased tempo, trying to force a mistake, trying to stake a claim through velocity alone. Muscles tensed, breath shortened. Footwork grew sloppy in the face of fatigue. Li Shen moved with the patience of a tide. When the onslaught finally sputtered, a single, almost casual touch was placed on the challenger's shoulder. The second challenger approached the trial like a cold calculation. His hands and hips coiled in the measured fashion of snake style. He flowed with the intent to find openings in the smallest seams, joints that gave a millimeter, balance that could be shifted by a whisper. He attacked with targeted strikes, angles that looked insignificant but could unmake posture if landed correctly. This time Li Shen did not simply move aside. His hands became water, his feet rooted like ancient pines. He mirrored the slow tempo, then introduced slight, almost invisible deviations. The two danced in a silent conversation of intent and counter-intent, a probing strike that bent to the left, a subtle weight shift that invited an overcommitment, a directing hand that converted incoming energy into a harmless arc. When the final exchange came, Li Shen guided the challenger's momentum with such finesse that the man found himself catching his own recovery, pausing, then bowing in acknowledgement. Precision had been answered with control. The lesson in that exchange was quiet and profound. Accuracy without adaptability could be elegant and deadly, but understanding another's movement, the decision behind it, was what dissolved the edge of intent. The third challenger stepped forward like a mountain. He moved with the low, unstoppable force of tiger style. Heavy feet, compressed breath, strikes intended to crush, to unbalance by sheer weight. The courtyard seemed to feel each step as a tremor. He did not rush. He did not dazzle. He simply came, each movement designed to land with devastating certainty. Li Shen met this different language of power not by conjuring equal force but by refining his structure. Bone aligned with bone. Joints became levers that could channel load into the earth. Breath synchronized with movement to create anchors and releases, so that when the tiger's weight came, the monk absorbed and reframed it. He allowed force to pass through predetermined channels that dispersed impact harmlessly into the stone beneath. On the decisive exchange, the challenger felt his own center tilt as if a subtle shift in the ground had moved him. He could not strike, could not retreat, the equilibrium was gone. The tiger stepped back, humbled, and offered a bow that was more an act of comprehension than defeat. After the 3 contests, a hush gathered like a second fog. The abbot, an elder whose years had smoothed the sharp edges of curiosity into patient questions, finally stepped forward. He had watched each exchange with the keen silence of someone who had seen many forms of victory and many masks of ego. When he approached, the bell of the temple seemed to hold its breath. His question was not sharp. It was simple. Why had Li Shen never taught the forms he practiced alone? Li Shen answered in the plain tones of someone for whom words were a measured tool rather than a weapon. He explained that those movements were not styles to be parroted or schools to be joined. They were not recipes for dominance. They were decisions. Speed, he said by example, is a decision to outrun the moment. Precision, a decision to exploit the seams of posture. Power, a decision to assert physical consequence into the opponent's body. None carried innate superiority. Timing decided their worth. The challengers had entered the courtyard prepared to win, to prove themselves superior in a way that could be tallied. Li Shen had entered to understand timing, breathing, alignment, and the intent behind each strike. Where they had sought to impose an outcome, he sought to read the unfolding and respond with a choice rooted in discipline rather than desire. The abbot listened, the morning sun breaking thin through the clouds, and the 3 challengers lowered their gazes, not in shame but in newfound respect for a different kind of mastery. The bell rang again once, a solitary echo that framed the morning like a punctuation mark. The challengers left the temple quietly, their footsteps absorbed by the same stones that had recorded their struggles. Li Shen returned to the courtyard and resumed his practice, a loop of motion that folded on itself without audience or applause. He moved through sequences that were less show and more study, micro-adjustments that sharpened nothing but knowing. He did not train to win accolades, he trained to remain. That idea, the persistence of practice without spectacle, is a subtle framing for what Shaolin Kung Fu can mean beyond its cinematic pageantry, an inward steadying that makes the outward effect appear effortless. Watching the morning unwind, it became clear that the trial had been less a contest of bodies and more a classroom for choices. Speed taught a lesson about the dangers of haste that is not guided by balance. Precision taught a lesson about the limits of exactness when it is not married to adaptability. Power taught a lesson about how raw force without structure can be redirected, absorbed, or nullified. Li Shen's reply about decisions boiled these lessons down to a philosophy. Martial skill is not purely about the technique itself but the moment it meets and the choice you make there. This is why forms cannot simply be passed on like recipes. They must be felt, adjusted, and chosen again and again until they become a reflex not of ego but of aligned intention. There is a humility in that conclusion. The challengers had come with a simple scoreboard in mind: who wins, who bows. They left with a more complicated ledger. What did each choice cost? What did it reveal about habit? And what does it mean to pursue mastery? The abbot's presence and Li Shen's silence had reframed their ambition into something quieter and harder to tally. One of the men walked away thinking about how he had relied on speed to hide insecurities. Another reflected on how precision had become a trap of predictability. The third was struck by the revelation that his strength could become a liability without the anchor of structure. Each carried a different understanding home, each corrected by a different corner of the training circle. The bell's final toll of the morning faded slowly, and the temple resumed its rhythms. Li Shen's practice continued, unnoticed by most, a private motion that mattered because it was consistent. The story that had unfolded in the courtyard would ripple outward in small ways. Conversations over tea, adjustments to practice, a new attention to breathing and to the way weight could be coaxed into the earth. The legend of the monk who did not fight to win but to understand would persist not because it was flashy, but because it carried a truth that could be tested in one's own movement and one's own choices. In the quiet that followed, the mountain seemed to keep the secret. The temple bell, when it rang in later days, would mark time and ritual, but the single clear note of this morning would linger as a reminder that mastery is less a destination and more a discipline. Li Shen's stance on the cold stone, feet bare, breath slow, eyes soft, was an image of a principle that can be carried into any craft, Practice unseen, refine persistently, choose deliberately. The challengers had come seeking a proof. They left with a lesson. The true test of Shaolin Kung Fu, the kind that stays with you after the applause and the blog posts fade, is not who watches. It is who remains.